Wayside School is Falling Down by Lewis Sacker, chapters 4 through 6. Homework. Mrs. Jules was teaching the class about fractions and decimals. She explained that 0.5 was the same as a half. Mac raised his hand. Mrs. Jules pretended not to see him. "Ooh, ooh," Mac groaned as he stretched his hand so high that it hurt. Mrs. Jules pretended not to hear him. Jenny raised her hand. "Yes, Jenny," said Mrs. Jules, glad to call on anyone besides Mac. "Mac has his hand raised," said Jenny. Thank you, Jenny," muttered Mrs. Jules. "Yes, Mac, what is it?" "I couldn't find one of my socks this morning," said Mac. "Man, I looked everywhere. In my closet, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, but I just couldn't find it. I asked my mother, but she hadn't seen it either." "That's very interesting, Mac," Mrs. Jules said patiently. "But what does that have to do with decimals?" "Because," said Mac, "I only could find half of my socks." "Oh, right," said Mrs. Jules. "Does anybody else have any questions about decimals?" "Yes, John." "Did you look under the bed?" asked John. "That was one of the first places I looked," said Mac, "but it wasn't there." "Did you check the dirty clothes?" asked Ron. "Maybe it was never washed." "I checked," said Mac. "Do you have a dog?" asked Bibi. "Maybe your dog took it." "No, my dog doesn't wear socks," said Mac. "Why didn't you just put on a different sock?" asked Allison, "even if it didn't match?" "I thought of that," said Mac. "See, but then if I wore a sock that didn't match, I'd be left with only one sock of that color for tomorrow, and then if I wore that sock, I'd have to wear a sock that didn't match with it, and so on for the rest of my life. I would never wear matching socks again." "Well, be that as it may," said Mrs. Jules, "we really need to get back to decimals." "Yes, Stephen?" "Once I had both my socks on," said Stephen, "but I wasn't wearing any shoes. My mom had just waxed the floor, too. I slid all around on it like I was skating. It was a lot of fun until I fell against the kitchen table and broke 2 dishes. Then I got in trouble." "What's that got to do with my socks?" Mac asked impatiently. Stephen shrugged. "Did you ever find your other sock?" asked Leslie. "Yep," said Mac, "but you'll never guess where." "In the refrigerator." He held out his arms in bewilderment. "How did it get there?" No one knew. "See, here it is," said Mac. He climbed on top of his desk so everyone could see his feet. He pointed to his left foot and said, "This is the sock I had from the beginning." He pointed to his right foot and said, "And this is the sock I couldn't find." His socks were red with gold lightning bolts down the side. "Ooh, hot socks," said Mauricia. "No, it was cold after being in the refrigerator," said Mac, still standing on top of his desk. I made up a song, too. While I was looking for it. You want to hear it?" He sang. "I got one sock, looking for the other, one sock, looking for its brother. When I find that sock, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put it on my foot and I'll stick it in my shoe." The bell rang for recess. "Since we didn't finish the arithmetic lesson," said Mrs. Jules, "you'll have to do the rest of it for homework." All the kids groaned as they headed outside. After recess was science. Mrs. Jules was teaching the class about dinosaurs. She told the class that there were 2 types of dinosaurs, those that ate meat and those that ate only vegetables. "You mean like broccoli?" asked Rondi. "I don't think they had broccoli back then," said Mrs. Jules. "Just as there were different kinds of animals back then, there were also different kinds of vegetables." Mac raised his hand. Mrs. Jules pretended not to see him. "Ooh, ooh," Mac groaned. He looked like he was going to explode. Mrs. Jules pretended not to hear him. She called on Myron. "Mac has his hand raised," said Myron. Thank you, Myron," muttered Mrs. Jules. "Yes, Mac?" "My uncle grew the biggest watermelon you ever saw in your whole life. Man, it was huge. It was so heavy I couldn't even lift it." "Mac, what does this have to do with dinosaurs?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Because that must have been the kind of watermelon that dinosaur ate," said Mac. "Did you eat it?" asked DJ. "Not all of it," said Mac, shaking his head. "Phew, it was too big for me, and I love watermelon." "What did it taste like?" asked Mauricia. "Delicious," said Mac, "but lots of seeds. You shouldn't eat the seeds, otherwise a watermelon might grow inside your stomach. I once heard about a lady who was so fat that everyone thought she was going to have a baby, but she didn't have a baby, she had a watermelon." "Was it a boy or a girl?" asked Joy. Everyone laughed. Mrs. Jules never finished her lesson about dinosaurs, so she had to assign it for homework. After school, Mac walked home with his girlfriend, Nancy. Nancy's class was on the 23rd floor of Wayside. Mac carried his arithmetic book, his science book, his reading book, his language book, and his spelling book. Nancy didn't have any books. I'll carry your books for you, Mac, she offered. Mac gave Nancy his books. Don't you have any homework, he asked. She shook her head. Man, it's unfair, said Mac. Mrs. Jules assigns more homework than any other teacher in Wayside School. Chapter 5. Another story about socks. Sherry brought a hobo to school for show and tell. They stood side by side at the front of the room. This is a hobo, said Sherry. I found him on the way to school. Oh, how neat, said Mauricia. The hobo had long, dirty hair and a scraggly beard. His shirt was covered with stains. His pants had lots of colorful patches. His coat was too big for him, but it wasn't as big as Sherry's coat. Sherry was a little girl, but she wore the biggest coat in all of Wayside School. The hobo wore old black shoes that also looked like they were too big for him, but that might have been because he wasn't wearing any socks. Tell the class something about your hobo, said Mrs. Jules. His name is Bob, said Sherry. I heard him ask a lady for spare change. The lady told him to take a bath. I tried to give him a quarter, but he said he never took money from kids. He said he likes kids a lot. He said he was once a kid himself. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Hobo Bob? Asked Mrs. Jules. All the children raised their hands. The hobo looked around the room. Yes, you, he said, pointing at Jason. When's the last time you took a bath? Asked Jason. I never take baths, said the hobo. Oh, wow, said Jason. You're lucky. What about a shower? Asked Myron. I just walk outside in the rain, said the hobo. When it rains, I have to go inside, complained Myron. Where do you live? Asked Joe. All over, said Bob. In the winter, I jump on a southbound train and ride until it's warm enough to jump off. In the summer, I go north where it's not too hot. How come you're not wearing any socks? Asked Leslie. I don't believe in socks, said Bob. Yes, the boy in the green shirt. Were you really a kid once? Asked Todd. Yep, said Bob. Did you get in trouble a lot? Asked Todd. No, I never got in trouble, said Bob. Todd smiled and nodded his head. Did you like to pull girls' pigtails? Asked Paul. Of course, said Bob. Who doesn't? Did you like ice cream? Asked Mauricia. I loved it, said Bob. What was your favorite subject? Asked Jenny. Spelling, said the hobo. Spelling? Exclaimed Jenny. I hate spelling. I once came in first place in a spelling bee out of all the kids in my school, Bob said proudly. Well, how come you become a hobo? Asked Damien. I mean, if you're such a good speller. I'm not sure, said Bob. When you grow up, you're supposed to turn into something. Some kids turn into dentists, others turn into bank presidents. I didn't turn into anything, so I became a hobo. Did you ever try to get a job? Asked Calvin. I tried, said Bob, but nobody would hire me because I didn't wear socks. So why didn't you just wear socks? Asked Eric Fry. I told you, I don't believe in socks. Yes, the girl with the cute front teeth. Rondi lowered her hand. She was missing her 2 front teeth. What do you eat? She asked. Mulligan stew, said Bob. My friends and I collect scraps of food all day, and then we cook it up in a big pot and share it. It's always different, but very tasty. Why is it called Mulligan stew? Asked Stephen. There was once a hobo named Mulligan, said Bob. He made the first Mulligan stew. Was he a good cook? Asked Todd. No, he was eaten by cannibals. Yuck, everyone said together, except for Dana, who was very confused. She thought Bob had said he was eaten by cannonballs. Allison raised her hand. Can't you just wear socks even if you don't believe in them? She asked. Socks, Bob shouted so loud it scared everybody. Is that all you kids ever talk about? Socks, socks, socks? Albert Einstein didn't wear any socks. Why should I? Who's Albert Einstein? Asked Eric Ovens. Mrs. Jules answered that question, she said. Albert Einstein was the smallest man who ever lived. Was he a hobo? Asked DJ. No, he was a great scientist, said Mrs. Jules. Why didn't Albert Einstein wear socks? Asked Joy. Because socks make you stupid, said Bob. That's not true, said Mrs. Jules. Albert Einstein was just too busy thinking about big important things to remember to put on his socks. Maybe, said Bob, but remember I told you I won the school spelling bee? Well, the day I won it, I forgot to wear socks. Think about it. Everyone thought about it. So, after that, I never wore socks again, said Bob. Mac raised his hand. Once I could only find one of my socks, he said. Man, I looked everywhere for it. Under the bed, in the bathroom. You'll never guess where I finally found it. In the refrigerator, said Bob. Mac's mouth dropped open. How did you know? Bob shrugged. Where else? Everybody had lots more questions for Hopeful Bob, but Mrs. Jewls rang her cowbell. Show and tell is over, she announced. Let's all thank Bob. Thank you, Bob, everyone said together. You're welcome, he replied. Do you know the way out of the school? Asked Cherry. I'm not sure, said Bob. Just go straight down the stairs, said Cherry. Thank you, said Bob. But don't go in the basement, warned Cherry. I won't, said Bob. He shook Sherry's hand, then waved goodbye to the rest of the class and headed out the door. Everybody waved back. Sherry returned to her seat. It was time for their weekly spelling test. Everyone take out a piece of paper and a pencil, said Mrs. Jewls. The first word is... Wait a second, called Calvin. I'm not ready yet. Mrs. Jewls waited while all the children took off their socks. Chapter 6, Pigtails. Hi, Leslie, said Paul. Hi, Paul, said Leslie. They were friends now. Paul hadn't pulled either of her pigtails for a long time. Paul sat in the desk behind Leslie. Once, a long time ago, he had pulled Leslie's pigtails. It felt great. That is, Paul thought it felt great. Leslie didn't think it felt too good. But that was earlier in the year when Paul was younger and immature. Now he knew better. Still, her two long brown pigtails hung in front of his face all day, every day. The bell rang for recess. Leslie, said Paul, can I talk to you a second? Sure, Paul, said Leslie. They were alone in the room. All the other kids had rushed down the stairs. Mrs. Jewls had to run to the teacher's lounge. I've been good, right? Asked Paul. I haven't pulled one of your pigtails in a long time, have I? So what do you want? A medal? Asked Leslie. Paul chuckled. No. Well, can I ask you something? Sure, said Leslie. Paul took a breath. May I pull just one of your pigtails? He asked. Please? No, said Leslie. Please, Paul begged. I won't pull it hard. No one will have to know. Please, please. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Please? You're sick, exclaimed Leslie. Paul lowered his head. I'm sorry, he said. You're right. I don't know what came over me. I won't ask again. Good, said Leslie. She shook her head in disgust. Paul watched her pigtails waggle. Can I just touch one? He asked. I won't even pull it, I promise. No. What's wrong with just touching one? Paul asked. Yuck, you're gross, said Leslie as she turned and marched out of the room. As Paul watched her go, her pigtail seemed to wave goodbye to him. He slapped himself in the face with both hands. What's wrong with me? He wondered. He walked to the side of the room and leaned over the counter. He stuck his head out the window to get some fresh air. Down below, he could see the kids playing on the playground. They looked like tiny toys. Leslie slipped back into the classroom. I'm getting my hair trimmed tomorrow, she announced. If you want, I'll save the pieces for you. It'll just be some split ends. Paul was so excited he forgot where he was. He quickly raised his head. It bashed against the window frame. Then he bounced forward and toppled out the window. Leslie stared in horror at the open window, then rushed toward it. She leaned over the counter and looked down. Help! Gasped Paul. There was one brick on the side of the building that stuck out a little further than the others. Paul desperately held on to it with both hands. I'll go get Louis, said Leslie. He'll save you. No, don't go, cried Paul. I can't hold on. My fingers are slipping. Leslie reached down for him. Try to grab my hand, she said. Paul made a grab for it but missed, then quickly clutched the brick. I can't. Help. I'm scared. Just don't look down, said Leslie as she tried to stay calm. She pulled her head back in through the window. Where are you going? Cried Paul. Help. Don't leave me. Leslie looked around Mrs. Jewls' classroom for a rope or an extension cord or something for Paul to grab, but she couldn't find anything. She returned to the window's side, then leaned out backward. Her hands tightly held the edge of the counter as she looked up at the sky. Grab my pigtails, she said, then winced. A big smile came across Paul's face. Really? He asked. Just do it, said Leslie. The pigtails hung about a foot above Paul's head. He let go of the brick with his right hand and grabbed her right pigtail. Yeah, Leslie yelped. He grabbed her left pigtail with his left hand. Yeah, she screamed. Okay, pull me in, said Paul. His legs dangled beneath him. Leslie's eyes watered in pain as she tried to step away from the window. I can't, she groaned. You're too heavy. Paul swung his legs up against the side of the building. Try now. Leslie groaned, then took a small step away from the window as Paul took a small step up the wall. Then they each took another small step. At last, Paul managed to get one foot on top of the brick that jutted out. Leslie pulled her head inside the window. As she took another step, Paul let go of one pigtail and grabbed the windowsill. Leslie took another step, pulling Paul the rest of the way through. They both collapsed on the floor, tired and sore. Ooh, my head hurts, said Leslie. Wow, you saved my life, said Paul. Well, don't worry. Someday I'll save yours. You don't have to, said Leslie. Just don't pull my pigtails any more. I won't, said Paul. Suddenly he laughed. What's so funny? Asked Leslie. This time your pigtails pulled me.